session is this session will be. We're thinking of starting. Okay. This session is towards a new paradigm too. We've, I think, only got 3 speakers, not 4, because Karl Heredia apparently is not here. So we'll have more time. And our first speaker will be Conaty, who works with Cooperatives UK and the New Economics Foundation, also in the UK. So, Pat.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I would like to kind of pick up on the threads, I think, from the last 2 speakers. In some way, I was very inspired with the lunchtime address of Sidney Greenfield about what we can learn from the past for the present, and also I've been working quite a bit in the UK with the social solidarity economy protagonists, and so my talk is also relates to the work that Peter was highlighting in his talk in the session before lunch. My paper, although I started out with an attempt to look at a pluralist commonwealth and try to look at the decommodification of money, land, and people in the paper, I found that too much of a stretch. So I just focused on new thinking around decommodifying land and money. But the focus of the paper is around a vernacular concept of the cooperative commonwealth. It's a concept that actually you find at the beginning of the cooperative movement, certainly very strong in the 1820s. It reoccurs in the 1840s, the 1880s, picks up again in the 1920s, you see it in the 1970s, and it's resurfacing now. And I like to think of it as cooperation in 4 dimensions. In other words, it's actually looking at how we can build commonwealth by the decommodification process in the full sense. And the default position, when the business as usual, the capitalism regains its strength, the default position is for cooperatives to focus really on the corporate question. How do we create co-ops? Rather than forget the land question, forget the money question, and forget actually the education question often as well. Okay, so let me kick off. Now, I'll try to indicate what I think are contours of a pluralist commonwealth beginning to emerge again. Certainly, there's a self-evident need for a new paradigm. The growing crisis of austerity and deepening cuts to public services is getting worse by the month in Europe, for certain. And we see in Europe a very worrying trend of the rise of a new right. It's a very sophisticated new right in the case of many countries, in that it's taking a different clothing, like the Tea Party in the United States. The United Kingdom Independence Party has replaced the National Front in being not overtly fascistic, but the xenophobic tendencies in that new alliance is very disturbing indeed. And so there is really a problematic in that there's the lack of a plan B for a new economy. There's some hope in the UK emerging, and some pushback that's been successfully expressing itself in recent years. The living wage campaign, for example, is getting much more traction. A community organizing group called London Citizens is having influence, is linking with faith groups, and the work by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett on the spirit level has expressed itself in a new organization called the Equality Trust, which local authorities are beginning to support. A number of local authorities are beginning to think about developing at the municipality and a town level cooperative councils, and some of those are beginning to emerge. Trade unions have been supporting the living wage campaign, and there's increasing numbers of local authorities agreeing not only to pay the living wage, but to insist that all their contractors pay the living wage. And that's beginning to get picked up by companies where the campaign is pushing in that direction as well. There's also been some successful campaigning linked to London Citizens and other organizations for campaigning against rack renting by landlords and new types of controls on rents, and also campaigns growing against payday lending. I think it's interesting and most notable to emphasize that really since the 80s, the deregulation of the beneficial constraints of usury laws has been pretty universal in many countries. In other words, the constraints of caps on interest. Payday lenders charging street legal loans of 5,000% APR has become a pervasive blight on low-income communities in the last 10 years. Could a common strategy, therefore, build and connect economic thinking and practice in horizontal and new integrated ways? I think thinking of the economics of the commons could be a way of maybe bringing the cooperative movement into the digital age, but also returning to the past of the cooperative commonwealth concepts. Elinor Ostrom's evidence of finding natural commons, methodically in case after case on every continent in relationship to fisheries management in the Philippines, river and meadows and forestry management in the Alps, water stewardship over centuries in Spain and Philippines, indicates the resilience of vernacular ways of managing resources for provisioning. So could the commons be a new operating system for the 21st century? That's a very interesting strategic question. If you break it down into the elements of a commons operating system, what Ostrom finds is first a common resource, second a group of collaborative stakeholders willing to steward and manage and co-develop that resource, a system of ethical rules to weed out shirkers, free riders, and vandals. We've seen the growth since 2008 of what's been called the shareable economy. That's expressing itself through digital platforms in different ways. It has an interesting history in terms of open source with the development of Linux and also Wikipedia. And those are very interesting forms of co-production. Basically, there's about a 15% market element in terms of work that's paid, and about an 85% free element of gifted labor, sweat equity that people put into the development. And the ability for those organizations to have such impact, indicates could the digital commons and natural commons extend into other areas for a 21st century economy. But we also see already a contest between the for-profit elements of the shareable economy and the non-profit elements. A very interesting contrast between Airbnb, which has been hugely commercially successful as a for-profit provider of accommodation, and on the other hand, Couchsurfing, which has got 5 million members, provides free accommodation in 97,000 cities and towns already. Very interesting. We've also seen since 2008 in the United Kingdom a growth in cooperative membership growth of about 5% a year to almost 15 million members now. Of course, there's been the debacle, on the other hand, of the cooperative bank, which has been taken over by 4 or 5 American hedge funds. So there's hope and despair there. But what's been very interesting in terms of the crowdfunding is that in the United Kingdom there's been huge growth of a very old phenomenon of cooperative capital raising at the local level. 10 years ago there were 2 to 3 community share issues a year. Now there are over 100 a year. So that's more than 2 a week. More actually community share issues numerically than IPOs on the stock exchange, although we're not raising anything like the amount of money yet. But still, the community share issues in the United Kingdom are raising £50,000 to £500,000 per project. About half of them are for renewable energy. A huge number of projects for the rescue and the buyout of community pubs that would otherwise close. The savings of rural shops. The regeneration of urban facilities across England and Wales, and also the mutualization of local football clubs. In Germany, over 50% of renewable energy is owned by people, democratically. So the process in Germany is quite significant. Only 7% of green energy is owned by big corporations. There's a very interesting history, and this is a bit about Back to the Future. If we look at the vernacular of the cooperative movement, and we look at the early days, and we go back to the beginning in the 1770s, 1775 is a very interesting year. In Birmingham, an interesting man called Richard Ketley set up the first terminating building society. Now, what was a terminating building society? Well, that's where the beginning of mutual savings and loans starts. He conceptualized, he was a publican, he conceptualized the idea that actually workers can provide their own housing, buy their own building plots, build their own homes in groups by collectively saving. They would collectively save over 10 years, and everyone would be guaranteed in the saving group, in the local pub, a home. And typically the payout would be at different points in the 10-year cycle, but everyone would save an agreed amount. 40% of the home would be paid for savings that they'd accumulate, and 60% was actually an interest-free loan. So it was interest-free finance. Now, this particular system became very, very widespread. It spread all over England. It started in the Midlands, spread to the north, spread into Ireland, spread into Scotland. And by 1870, it was the main form of mortgage finance in the United Kingdom. It was interest-free lending. It continued until 1910, when it was banned by Parliament. There was another system which started in the 1840s called the Star-Boket Society, which was equally successful and was also banned around 100 years ago. But there's been a continuing use of this particular form of interest-free lending. So, for example, in the Great Depression, farmers who were facing evictions and loss of their land in Denmark set up these revolving clubs as well as cooperative societies. They still exist today, but they were used in the 1930s to provide for agricultural equipment, working capital loans, and also housing. Today in Denmark they still exist. They're quite small, but the one in Sweden has got 35,000 members. In my paper there's an interesting example of how this system since 1965 has continued to operate. But also further afield. So, for example, in Brazil, yes, thank you. In Brazil, Co-op has set up over a number of years these terminating building societies. They start with groups of 1,000 people who come together and save for a 10-year period. They allocate 100 mortgages a year, and these groups are building cooperative housing at the moment. Also, it's very interesting to note that out of the civil rights movement, in Georgia, the Habitat for Humanity was launched. And they've operated this Fund for Humanity. The Fund for Humanity is an interest-free loan fund that charges a fee but no interest. And they've provided over 500,000 homes in more than 90 countries on interest-free finance principles. So this stuff is below the radar. It's not talked about. It's countercultural. It's repressed. And it does work. I've been involved in recent years looking at the land question. Very impressed with the work of the Community Land Trust movement in the United States, which grew out of the work of the Civil Rights Movement in '68. Now there are about 250 community land trusts. We were very impressed with the work of Burlington, Vermont, and the work of Bernie Sanders when he was the mayor, now the senator, to provide £1 million in 1984 of a revolving fund from the municipality's pension fund to support the Community Land Trust movement in Burlington, Vermont, when Reagan had cut all the grants. That particular movement has built the largest community land trust movement not far from here on Lake Champlain, called the Champlain Housing Trust, over 2,000 homes, also producing workspace. So we began this work in the United Kingdom about a decade ago, working out of the University of Salford, a unit called the Community Finance Solutions Unit. And we went on a journey to see if we could develop 30 community land trusts in urban areas of the UK and 30 in rural areas. After 5 years, that was a national demonstration project, we'd already developed 22, all in rural. We had set up the project in the urban areas, but we couldn't get the politics and the city council behind us. That's beginning to change. So now we're seeing the emergence of community land trusts in East London, in Liverpool, in Middlesbrough, in Cardiff, and a number of cities in the United Kingdom. So the urban CLT movement has begun. But this community land trust movement also goes back to 1775, when a very interesting man called Thomas Spence, he was watching the encroachment of the moor, which was a kind of a park area on Newcastle-on-Tyne, being resisted in 1771 over 4 years. And he came to the idea, well, enclosure is happening, enclosure is actually going to lose this precious kind of village, this city resource. So he recommended the idea of a parish land trust. The idea that actually you could become social landlords for the land in the area of the parish could be brought into commonwealth, could be brought into control. It would be possible, therefore, for the people of that city to capture the economic rent and to use the economic rent for the social benefit of the town dwellers. The idea didn't get very much traction, but it was at that time. But he died and it's called the Spence Plan. He died in 1814. But Robert Owen begins to pick up this idea in his ideas for cooperative communitarian land experiments. The Chartist Land Company actually had raised £70,000 that's what they raised in 1846 to develop Chartist land villages. They developed five or six. They were shut down by Parliament in 1851. However, if you read Mill's writing in Book 4 of Principles of Political Economy, when he argues for the bringing into the Commonwealth of the land, that directly impacted on the thinking of the municipal socialists in the 1880s to develop and clear the slums in Birmingham and Glasgow, in Liverpool, and a number of cities. The first garden city, this is my last point, of Letchworth did not get popular control in 1903 when it was started from the government. It did get trade union support, it did get cooperative support, and they built over 50 years. Letchworth Garden City bought 5,500 acres of land. All of the city was on cooperatively owned land. So that by 1945, the city had all the land, all the commercial rents. It had become a city of 33,000 people according to the plan, and it was a cooperative city intended to be resilient, intended to actually be self-financing. It was the only experiment of its kind. We've had 2 conferences at Letchworth in the last 3 years to revive this concept of cooperative ownership of land and finance. If you look to the work that's happening in Cleveland today with the evergreen cooperatives, what you see at the heart of that is a community land trust approach to a city that has lost, like Liverpool, 700,000 population, and has all this land that actually is vacant. And they are turning to the organizations and saying, you organizations that are hardwired to place because you cannot go offshore and leave, the universities, the city council, the hospital, use your procurement to regenerate Cleveland, to be proud again for the 21st century. And so the Green Mondragon approach of the Democracy Collaborative of Ted Howard and the Karl Paravitz and others in Cleveland is beginning to use the power of the procurement ability of those anchor institutions, the cities, the hospitals, the universities, the Cleveland Foundation, which is $3 billion a year, to actually create a demand and supply curve that allows resilient urban redevelopment. The situation, though, is important in relation to cost of capital. The core part of that fund is a £200 million revolving community land fund to provide low-cost capital. The point that Keynes drew in his general theory, if you look at the end when he talks about economic heretics, is that he made the argument for cheap money. So the Keynesian Accord was actually built on keeping the cost of capital very low over a long period of time to build the welfare state, to build public housing, to build infrastructure. And that loss of control of usury, the beneficial constraint of usury laws, is really, really a core problem. Okay? So it is this need for decommodification to provide money for service, not for profit, to actually create the cooperative commonwealth again. There's enormous opportunity to look at the land question and the money question, these are two taboo subjects where people do not go because that's where the vernacular truth is. Thank you.
My title is the Great Transformation, the Redistributive Imperative for Development. And right off the bat, I should say that this is more of an idealist paper rather than, it's working off principle rather than possibility, in the sense that I'm not suggesting that what I'm going to present is possible necessarily in the current political economy, but that it's the principles that ideally we would move towards. And that principle is basically, I think, really the necessity of bringing back a redistributive agenda, center place in the international development agenda, in a way that's been somewhat sidelined by both, I would say, the right and the left, to a certain degree. And also, in that sense, really perhaps making the case for the necessity of a sort of a new great transformation, but at a global level rather than at national levels or regional levels. And I'm not sure how this fits in exactly with the whole discussion of multipolarity, and whether it's a reformist suggestion or a revolutionary suggestion in terms of those types of dichotomies. But let me present the stuff and see what you think. And it also builds off, I took a bunch of shortcuts to prepare the paper for this presentation, but it builds heavily off a background paper I wrote for the UNDP Human Development Report of this year, and which implicitly, I think, combines ideas from Karl Polanyi as well as Celso Furtado, a big inspiration, and also some post-Keynesian thinking. I think all those three elements I really identify me as coming out of McGill at a certain period of time when I was taught by Kerry and a few post-Keynesian scholars. So I'll just go straight into it. I mean, the central thesis is basically that that we need to understand redistribution as an essential and inherent synergistic condition of production and distribution within modern capitalism. And without that appreciation of redistribution, we actually could just create dysfunctional forms of capitalism. And in particular, with respect to developing countries, without an appropriate appreciation for the redistributive element or imperative within development, developing countries, poor countries, have a difficult time really launching more organized forms of development. The most simple expression of organized forms of development is having formal labor rather than informal labor, for instance. And then the role of the state is critical in this regard. I would say there was a discussion in the first day about why are we emphasizing so much on the state? Can there not be other forms of institutions? What I would suggest is that from this perspective, the state, up until the present, is the institution that has the most potential to achieve national level, at least national level forms of redistribution that other institutions cannot achieve. Ideally, we need to go beyond that, but also Barbara Harris-White has obviously made the point that non-state forms of social regulations are often more regressive than the option, no matter how imperfect the state is, often non-state forms, for instance, social regulation of labor through caste, through ethnicity, through gender, and so on, are often more regressive than through state structures of labor regulation. So it's working within that rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And what I would say is that we can try and understand this redistributive imperative, as I call it, through both a structural and an institutional lens, and I quite appreciated that discussion by, sorry, I always get his name, Peck. Jeremy Peck? Jamie Peck, thank you. Jamie Peck, on talking about that, on the first night, talking about the structural and institutional and how it affects the ideational. The structural, in this sense, and I think Kerry referred to this idea yesterday, which was the necessity of socializing the wealth in production systems that are increasingly productive over time, to an extreme extent, and also that are more and more globally integrated, as we know. And what this does is it puts an increasing pressure on the tertiary sector over time to absorb labor. Right? And the institutional argument is is basically the importance of redistribution in bolstering and supporting the institutional capacity to plan and also to achieve cross-class settlements within the processes of development. So the structural perspective, you could look at the structural perspective in terms of the two wings that Karl Polanyi talked about, one being commodification and the other one being the factory system, right? If I've understood that correctly. In the sense, I find in these Polanyi conferences we tend to focus a lot on the commodification, but less on the factory system. But let me just quickly deal with both of those. I mean, in the contemporary context, if we understand what I would suggest here, I'm not necessarily referring to commodification here, but it's the underlying population processes that underlie a lot of commodification. In that sense, Polanyi, I think, he wasn't a demographer, and he wasn't necessarily looking at the role that population growth was playing in the processes of commodification in the 19th century, but obviously understanding that England was going through, from about the mid-19th century or early 19th century onwards, a phase of quite rapid population growth that was obviously contributing to the situation. And the fact that what we're seeing today in developing countries, particularly in Africa and South and Central Asia, is far more intense rates of population growth, leading to multiplying rates, as they say in demography, that are, however you measure it, whether it's give or take 2 or 3 times or whatever, far greater than whatever Europe ever experienced without the colonial wealth and without the massive outflow of labor that occurred onto the temperate climates, whose populations were decimated to allow for the European settlers to arrive into. So, I mean, the extreme case, we look at Uganda, for instance, where, according to recent UN estimates, we'd be looking at a population multiplying factor of about 20 times between 1950 and the year 2050. And even if they reduce fertility, even if they introduce a one-child policy tomorrow, which they won't, given the politics of Museveni, even if they would do that, that would possibly end up being 15 times as opposed to 20 times, as compared to multiplying rates in, say, the UK of 2 times perhaps, or in Europe 2 to 3 times, often not much more than that. So what we're effectively looking at in a lot of developing countries is essentially an employment crisis. It's not the question so much of whether this is a neo-Malthusian situation of resource constraints and so on, because Uganda, even at current population, has a much lower population density than, say, Germany, and even at 100 million would have a lower population density than Netherlands. So whether it's overpopulated we can debate, but the key point is that in that context, with the grade of change, it's definitely facing employment crisis. And the reality is most of that increase in employment that will happen over that period of time will necessarily be absorbed by the tertiary sector of employment, not by the primary sector, which doesn't really have much capacity to absorb more labor, and the secondary sector, which is becoming less and less and less, where it exists, is becoming less and less labor absorbing. And mining, of course, has become extremely capital intensive and so on. So the other wing of the structural story is, of course, the factory system, which, as we've said today, has achieved, even in the last 30 years of neoliberalism, we tell the story of how financial capitalism has been divorced from the productive needs of the economy, and yet, nonetheless, productivity in production processes has continued to escalate across the board over the last 30 years under financialized neoliberalism. I mean, this is just an example of a current Fiat car factory where, I challenge you to find the worker in this photo, basically. I think you can see one there, right? But it's the state of productivity today in physical production, both agriculture and manufacturing, that simply just does not generate the employment demand. And I'm not, how's the time? So I forgot to time myself.
Yeah, we've got
10
minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Oh, wow. Okay, good. Phew. Okay. So, and so what this does is it places much more pressure on the tertiary sector relative to the past to absorb the labor. And it's not so much an issue of the tertiary sector not being able to generate the employment. I agree with Mario's point that we have the point you made yesterday about the tertiary sector potentially being a huge generator of jobs. That's not necessarily the issue, but the issue is that the tertiary sector, much more than the primary and secondary sector, relies on redistributive mechanisms to create the labor demand and also to establish the value of the labor within, once employed, versus any considerations of productivity. Because I've written about this, when you enter the tertiary sector, thinking about productivity becomes very problematic because you're actually not producing any physical thing that you can actually measure and so on. So I've called this the fallacy of productivity reductionism, but in any case. So just to give an example of that in the care economy, and this draws off some feminist literature on the care economy, it's well recognized in this literature, empirically shown and so on, that there's an undervaluation of care labor relative to other types of labor with equivalent levels of education and skills. So there's an inherent tension within the care sector, which is the example Mario gave of where we could expand employment, for instance. There's an inherent tension within the care sector between the supply... Oh.
Sorry.
Okay, no. Well, so we shouldn't interrupt the greetings. Oh, is that Carlos? Oh, is that Karl? Okay. Pause, yes, okay. Hi, Carlos.
That cuts you down to 5 minutes.
Okay. Sorry, no. Carlos, you used up 5 minutes of your time, guys. So, anyways, back to the care sector, or the caring greetings and so on. There's an inherent tension in the care sector, what we're facing today, what's known as the care crisis in the US, for instance, between the supply of high-quality care services, which we need more and more and more, and on the same time, the difficulty of controlling costs with respect to this care labor, which in many cases is quite highly educated. And there's a pressure on wages in the care sector, and the pressure on wages in the care sector, of course, increases the demand for immigrant labor to supply that labor. And arguably, what's happening is that it's actually the pressure on wages that creates the demand for the immigrant labor rather than the other way around, which is the way the sort of the conservative argument would make it, that it's the immigrants pushing down wages. What I would argue here is that the inherent problem with this situation in the care economy is one of the business model of the care sector, whereby the costs of the care sector are internalized at the business unit level, right? And this is actually a challenge I put forward to the whole social economy literature, because as much as I greatly appreciate it, if your unit basically that has to absorb the costs in the care sector is at the business level, whether it's non-profit or profit and so on, it has a difficult time to absorb the costs of that labor that are required to provide the services and so on. And the way to break the link, so this downward spiral, is basically through socializing the costs of care, through universal forms of provisioning in those costs of care, which also requires the government to decommoditize care by cutting the link between the need and the pricing, for instance. And also it requires more indirect forms of financing of care, as we have in the models of universal health care, for instance, and so on. And that way, by doing that, you can actually sustain the demand for the labor at wages that are appropriate for the levels of education and types of skills that you need in those sectors, and so on and so on. So it's just an example of the importance of the redistributive and universalistic processes in sustaining labor demand and labor value in these types of service sectors. On the institutional argument, I figured at this point I'd be running out of time, and it's a complicated 3 minutes. So what I would do is briefly read you a few quotes from Furtado. But essentially, this is me paraphrasing Furtado, is what he identified the rise of industrial capitalism with the rise of unified planning, referred to as economic policy, which was achieved through the emergence of modern nation states from the mid-18th century onwards. This showed two relevant countervailing features: a progressive concentration of economic power and highly effective organization of wage-earning masses as the two countervailing features. Within such organized capitalism, this is basically Furtado's words, which is best conceived as a system of social organization rather than simply a form of organizing production. I find in this sense, when I read Furtado, the similarity to Polanyi is amazing and wonderful. Political power. political power conceived as blah, 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 emerges as a complex structure in which the institutions comprising the state interact with the groups that dominate the accumulation process and with the social organizations capable of intervening in a significant way in the distribution of income. So through the rapid accumulation, though rapid accumulation was certain, let me summarize this quote here. What he's essentially saying is that the outcome in Europe of rising wages in accordance with rising productivity was not necessarily a necessity, it was a possibility. It was a potential. And it was only achieved through what he argues near the end here. The form of society that came to prevail in industrial capitalist countries was not a historical necessity, but simply a historical possibility. And if this possibility materialized, it was in large measure thanks to the power progressively exercised through the organization of the large social majorities who earn their livelihood by selling their labor capacity on the market. And then what he says then is that, I'm paraphrasing, summarizing a lot here, but he says the challenge for contemporary developing countries is that in the context of the increasing transnationalization of production, weakens the ability of what he acknowledges as increasingly effective forms of social organization to exert pressure on the growing power of enterprises for a more immediate distribution of income, or redistribution. Because whereas, this traditional tendency, the traditional tendency of, I'm running out of time, for the state to broaden its bases of support, the same tendency today is undercut by the fact that the power responsible for coordinating increasingly complex international economic relations has shifted to a large extent from the nation state to large enterprises and corporations. And hence there's this undercutting of the traditional mechanism whereby social mobilization and the state would interact together to provide the countervailing power to capital in that sense. And as I summarize here in my own words, what I essentially see as he's arguing is that deregulation in this sense is a privatization of this regulatory capacity. So, which I think we all agree with. And it's essentially brings about the necessity of bringing the redistributive struggle to a global level to match this type of disjuncture and so on. And I was going to then, in the last 30 seconds, basically frame this in terms of what I call a Gershon-Cronian redistributive principle, which is that this redistributive imperative of development intensifies the later you are in the process of so-called late development and late industrialization and so on. You can make a corollary with demography and so on. And basically where what we've been seeing is a retreat from these redistributive processes. We actually need to be going in the opposite direction, in summary. And I was going to show you some graphs, but I don't have time to do that. But it more or less follows on quite well with James's topic, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And he's going to speak on the social economy in Mexico, a movement to democratize the economy, or he was going to speak on that. I don't know if he still is.
How about this one? Well, first of all, an apologies in order for disrupting the panel. I was supposed to be here yesterday and today, but then I'm only here right now. Great to see old friends, and I hope new friends. I'm Carlos Heredia, a student of Carrie's, and a classmate of James's, and très bon ami and Michel. Merci d'être là. And I'm going to speak on precisely the social economy in Mexico, a movement to democratize the economy. I should start out by explaining how I got involved into this, and it was basically Margie Mendel organized a seminar on the social economy laws in different countries, and I came to speak on the social economy law in Mexico, which still very much, it has been passed by our Congress, but what's a working process is the social economy itself. It's already a law, but it's a sector in the making. So we don't have many very precise, exact measures of what it represents in terms of the gross domestic product of the country. But let me give a wide description of what it is, or at least how I define it and how it is defined in the law. There may be some nuances there. We're talking about the sector of the economy that is composed of workers' organizations, cooperatives, community organizations, companies that belong to the workers and are owned and operated by the workers. So this nuance is very important because, at least in the literature in Latin America, you often find that corporations that invest at the base of the pyramid are considered part of the social economy. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the sector of the economy that is owned and operated by the workers and the producers themselves at a community level. The law that was passed in Mexico a couple years ago is like the implementing legislation of Article 25 of our Constitution. And that law makes a distinction between the private sector, the public sector, and the social sector of the economy, and that's where they bring us into the picture. Now, I am part of a fund that is called Fides, like faith, that is trying to raise money to invest, to make capital investments in companies and enterprises of the social economy. So it's not loans, it's risk capital. That's what we're trying to do. But at first, I'm going to try and describe what we're looking at when we talk about the social economy. To begin with, I should say that Mexico, it's no different from many economies in Latin America. There's a highly oligopolistic economy. Pretty much wherever you look around, you're going to find a very heavy concentration of wealth and ownership of companies in a few hands. You name a sector of the Mexican economy, and I can tell you it is highly oligopolized. So it's basically 300 groups that concentrate ownership of the largest companies with their international partners. So in a company that is highly oligopolized, and in an economy that is highly oligopolized, there's not much room for startups that are born out of the communities, and where the main actor are the producers themselves. Geography-wise, I'm talking basically about, at least for the fund that I work with, we're talking about the central western part of Mexico, Guanajuato, Michoacán, Jalisco, and the south and southeastern part of Mexico, Oaxaca, Chiapas. And many of those cooperatives and social enterprises are born out of the work of the progressive wing of the Catholic Church. So many were born out of the efforts of a parish, the work of the Jesuits, the Dominican priests, the diocesan priests that started a cooperative, that started a group of producers getting together, a group of women saving money, and then grew into companies that some of them have annual sales now of about $200 million, that are companies that are significant players in the market now. However, as I said in the beginning, there's no statistic of the social economy in Mexico. There are very many rough estimates that differ quite a bit among each other. So some people say it's 7% of GDP. How did you measure it? Well, we put together everything that we thought should be included, but not really any precision, not really any rigor in measuring it. At the international level, we have established some links with Mouvement des Jardins, ici, with the Mondragon movement in Spain, with the companies that are with several popular movements in Brazil, Uruguay, with the several banks that are born out of cooperative efforts in Europe, and in some other places in Latin America. But I have to admit that we can still be described, like I said, as an effort, as a work in progress, as an effort that is striving to be recognized and to grow, and to especially to help people take advantage of their own work. So basically, that's the overall idea. Our cooperatives and our groups of producers are in the production of food, are in cooperatives of housing, transportation, health, finance, artisan production, and others. And of course, the values that sustain our work are to the respect for the environment, and the breeding of a new business culture, the generation of goods and services at competitive prices, generation of new value chains in the economy, and the reevaluation of teamwork. Now, one principle is that these companies do not receive subsidies. We're looking for capital investments. That's the whole idea. But again, the groups and banks that are willing to invest in companies of the social economies are not abundant. 2 words on the law. We have tried to garner support among other sectors of society for the social economy. There are several universities, including mine, the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, that are actively working. We worked on the drafting of the law. The Jesuit universities are also working on this, and we have a small research center that is devoted to this. And then we are working with several ministries in the Mexican government to make them understand what this is all about, because more often than not, they will say, "Oh, you want grants, you want subsidies," and they say, "No, this is a different thing." We work with the Ministry of Social Development. The Ministry of Social Development has as its mandate programs to make people that are poor getting a transit towards becoming middle class. That is easier said than done. We haven't been as successful as the Brazilians in lifting up people from widespread poverty to becoming middle class, especially because once the government subsidies are gone, and we are not part of that, then you don't have a clear-cut path towards the inclusion in the productive economy. The Ministry of the Economy has a National Institute of the Social Economy, Instituto Nacional de Economía Social, that is supposed to support the kind of work we're doing. Nacional Financiera, which is the National Development Bank, we also work with them. And a branch of the central bank has an operation to support rural and agricultural production, and we also work with them. Our fund, the Fides Fund, has a portfolio of some 40 companies in the different sectors and different geographical areas that I mentioned. Different sizes, but from tiny upstarts to companies. The largest one must be, like I said, selling about $200 million per year. And we have gone through a process of qualification of the producers themselves that is, I think it's quite remarkable, but the merit goes mainly to the priests and the social workers and the lay workers that provided the initial training. Give you one example. In Oaxaca, we have this indigenous young man. His native language is Zapotec, spoken throughout various regions of Oaxaca, and he is like the organic intellectual of a very large group of coffee producers. Now he knows the London market inside out. You know, he really puzzles bankers when he talks to them because he corrects the bankers and he says, no, the information you have is wrong. I've checked and this is the latest information. And so it's, you know, it's no surprise that it's gained some traction because we're basically the notion of social economy is to invest in our own people. That's basically the thrust of the work. And just one final word on how this connects to Karl Polanyi's work. I think that, to paraphrase the Great Transformation, I think at least the transformation we need in Mexico, in Latin America, is precisely that, to how to invest in our own people so we can transform our societies. And I'll close here.
I debated whether or not I should use PowerPoint. I don't really like it very much. I'm really delighted to be here. This is a case where, you know, I too am a student of Carrie Polanyi Levitt. And so I feel a bit like I pale in the face of my teacher as well as my student, because Andrew was my student as well. Pat, you're the odd one out because Carlos here and I were together as well in class. It was a great reunion. Okay. So, I'm talking about China's great transformation in comparative perspective. And if there were a subtitle, it would be Agriculture and the Commodification of Land. Now, this may not sound quite as trendy as what's going on, what we talked about in Mexico and in London. But I think that what happens in China, what's happening now in China, what's going to happen in China in the future is going to affect the whole world. And so it's quite important. For a long time, I thought Polanyi's ideas, his understanding of capitalism and the societies that came before capitalism was very, very important to development, to problems of late development. Even though, as Carrie taught me a long time ago, that was not the project of her father's work. But in recent years, I've been wrapped up in looking at the political economy of the state, a program that we call the Crisis States Research Program at the LSE, and I became even more convinced of the relevance of Polanyi's ideas during this work. In the last couple of years, I've turned my attention back to China, where I began my studies 41 years ago, and somehow dropped it along the way. And I've been trying in the last couple of years when I've been giving lectures and talking to students in China and to fellow colleagues and academics, as well as some people from the government, to introduce the ideas of Karl Polanyi. focusing on a subject that I know something more about, which is agriculture and land rights, and the debate over these in China today, which is really quite sharp and very strategic. I mean, I don't think it's the only kind of set of ideas that could be reintroduced or introduced to China. It would be good to introduce more of Karl Marx as well, I think. But you know, as I do this, and as I've been doing this in China, I've also kept in mind what I learned from another one of my most important teachers here in Montreal. That was Sam Numoff, who introduced me to the study of China and its political economy, its socialist experience, and taught me to be rather modest and humble in my observations about what's going on in this gigantic social transformation, this gigantic experience of accelerated development and human development. So there's a great divide among old China hands and new China hands, I suppose, around whether what China is experiencing is socialism with Chinese characteristics, as the Chinese Communist Party still argues, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as other people argue. I really don't know about this. I'm not going to take any stand on that. But what I am convinced about is China is experiencing development with Chinese characteristics. And I think it's the most extraordinary experience of late development, of accelerated growth that the world has ever seen, with monumental achievements in reducing poverty and in improving human development. In the time span of just 35 years, China's per capita gross national income grew 14-fold. This has never happened anywhere else in that kind of time period. That's just between 1980 and 2011. But of course, there's great costs along the way. And I'll have occasion to mention one of the worst errors in China leading to one of the worst famines in the 20th century, after the Great Leap Forward in China in the early 1960s, and the mounting pressure also that China's accelerated growth is having on the global environment. Some would argue that China's experience over the last 30 years presents a fundamental challenge to Karl Polanyi's proposition about the destructive character of the commodification of land, labor, and money. Because China has achieved much of this accelerated growth in the last 30 years by introducing market reforms. So the message we get from different mainstream economists is that what China really needs to do is to introduce the full commoditization of land, money, and labor, and adopt liberal democracy. So this was the big theme in a report that was issued last year by the World Bank and the Development Research Center of the State Council of China, called China 2030. And there's particular recommendations in that report that advocate in agriculture the absolute land privatization of land ownership, free markets in land, the end of subsidies to agriculture, and of course the investment in offshore, off-farm industry. But also in mainstream economics, we have the advocates of complete commodification across these three factors of production. First of all, out of the stall of institutional economists, Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail. Paul Collier, the neoclassical economist, development economist par extraordinaire, who's very influential. The William Easterly, the libertarian, former World Bank economist, and also I have to add Amartya Sen, the liberal economist for whom we all have great respect. For all of them, this prescription has been put forth for China? Well, from my point of view, I think just the opposite. Exactly the opposite. I think that it's precisely by limiting the commodification of land, labor, and capital that China's achieved its developmental progress. And also today that the big questions that matter in China turn precisely around how far to pursue the commoditization of land, labor, and money. And also the double movement in China, where we see plenty of evidence of how society in diverse and complex ways is reacting against the negative consequences of commodification, of what Polanyi labeled the three fictitious commodities. So in my paper, I'm concentrating just on land, but we could look at labor and we could look at money in the same light in China. So there are two really big insights from Polanyi that are relevant to China's role in the Great Transformation and the debates about the future. And we've talked a lot about this during these last few days. There's nothing natural about the market. And I think the state, and Polanyi showed how the state had to forcefully introduce and subordinate society to principles of market. We have plenty of evidence for this in China in its early period, its pre-socialist period, and we have evidence, interestingly, in more recent years. The second big insight is around fictitious commodities and the double movement. And that's that the more the land, labor, and money are commoditized, the stronger will be society's reaction against the negative effects of this. And it will call forth also the state to regulate, temper, restrict what markets do. So I think in these two very broad insights of Polanyi, there's a lot have a lot to offer to those who are trying to understand China. Now, what I'm trying to do here is pretty ambitious. I'm going to run right through history since 1949. And I want to say just something about how the limitation of the commodification of land has been so pivotal and central to what China has achieved. So first of all, if we think about the socialist revolution taking place between 1949 and 1977 in China, the abolition of land markets was absolutely central, and the vesting of ownership of land in various cooperative forms over time. This is a picture of a fantastic book that talks about the early stages of this by William Hinton Fan Shen. Between 1949 and 56, China achieved huge increases in agricultural production as a result of its first land reform and land redistribution. In the collectivization period between 62 and 78, a former colleague of mine, a colleague of Andrew's, Ashwani Seth, in what I think is quite a brilliant comparative paper on China and India, argues that there was a huge institutional innovation in China, and that is a mass mobilization mode of production, a very controversial proposition. But what we could argue is that during this collectivization period, there was the creation of infrastructure on which later economic progress has been based. A massive creation of infrastructure and the transformation of the countryside. One way to understand China's achievements during this period is to compare what happened in China with what happened in India. Okay. Roughly in the 1950s, India and China were about in the same place. They had similar per capita income. They had similar productivity of land and agriculture. They had similar industrial production in steel and cement sectors. So in some ways, and a similar share of manufacturing in GDP, which is really quite important in relationship to what Andrew was talking about in terms of the challenges of structural change. And if we look at the achievements of the two countries during this period, we see what's most remarkable is the industrial transformation of China. That is the shift in the share of the GDP generated by industry. Whereas by 1980, the share of industry in China's GDP was almost 50%, whereas in India, only 21.9%. I'm not going to go through all these data because I'll run out of time. At the same time, this was the period, as I mentioned a moment ago, that there were important errors, and errors that had monumental consequences, and the most important one was the Great Leap Forward. We could talk about it more afterwards. And this caused regionally specific rural famine of enormous proportions. This is documented, I think, in a very insightful way in a memoir, Tombstone by Yang Zhishang. It's still an issue that needs to be debated and understood and discussed in China. But in the wake of this, there was a huge readjustment in China, and I think it's a readjustment that stood the test of time. So after the Great Famine, Mao Zedong more or less lost influence. Reformers who were always present in the Chinese Communist Party came to the fore, and there was a major reorganization of agriculture and reforms to protect rural livelihoods. And throughout the rest of the period, and right up until today, I would argue, the Chinese Communist Party has been very attentive to what all their various development efforts, what kind of impact it has on rural people. And that too, even during the most fiery days of the Cultural Revolution. From the early 1980s, when the reforms began, industry began to support agriculture. In other words, we had a reversal of the price scissors that operated earlier, where resources were extracted from agriculture to fund industrialization. And this is very important because I think this is something that is crucial that China continue in the future. If we look at the market reforms since 1978, very briefly, all of you have heard about this, so I can just remind you. One of the most important reforms began in agriculture, and it was the introduction of the household responsibility system. This was something that grew up from initiatives of peasants, and this often happens in China. Most of its programmatic reforms are piloted on small scales or initiatives that the leadership has observed and then tries to generalize. The household responsibility system gave security to farmers on the land and harnessed market incentives.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, well, I'll try. This, along with the town and village enterprises and the big push to attract FDI, stimulated and this growth acceleration, in Danny Roderick's terms, that lasted for another 2 decades. Okay. Between 1978 and 2009, agricultural annual growth was at 4.5%. Between 81 and 2001, nationwide poverty fell from 58% to 8%. Definitely along with expanding inequality. But this achievement in poverty reduction is the one that's quite unparalleled. And overall unprecedented. But this has all led to discontinuities today. So migrant labor has been expanding exponentially year after year from the rural areas to the cities and denied residents in the urban areas for important historical reasons, but in a way that has had various kinds of perverse impacts in the rural areas. It means that the migrants try to hold on to land in their villages as a form of social security, even if it means the land is farmed unproductively. Also, we've seen local governments starved of finance. And what that has led to is a practice by the cooperatives in whose power and hands land ownership is is vested, alienating land for industrial, residential, and agribusiness purposes to fund their own operations. And we've seen this kind of process of creeping commoditization of land leading to rural protests. Rural protests in a way that would be predicted by the operation of the double movement in Polanyian terms. There's a call then for the state to intervene and to limit land markets, limit the impact of land markets. So what way forward? Now I have probably 3.5 minutes. Well, interestingly enough, I read an article by Samir Amin last year, and Carrie could tell you there was a time in my life where I never wrote a paper without citing Samir Amin.
That's why they're linking him to Polanyi too.
Yes, actually, the first person to link him to Polanyi.
You.
And I seldom cite Samir Amin these days because he never has any empirical foundation for whatever he says. But since I'm also giving you a paper with no empirics behind it and just reflections, I feel happy to cite him. He locates China's unique path in its decision not to privatize land. And I think this is a very important insight. He said that China refused to make land a commodity. And by doing so, they gained the advantages through the responsibility system of capitalist family farming without privatizing the land. In it, he saw the Chinese Communist Party building a kind of developmental alliance with rural producers. That allowed them to increase production, to feed urbanization. It strengthened food sovereignty, which is a really important issue all across the developing world. And today, more than ever before, even though it's not fashionable among neoliberal economists to talk about that. And he argues that the resultant arrangements could be the basis of village democracy today in China. And the social and could accommodate the social claims people are making today. China, he says, and this I found really interesting because it intersected with something I've been working on for a long time. He said China, along with South Korea and Taiwan, are unique in creating truly sovereign production system. And I think this is really important because the comparative perspective that I develop in my paper and don't have much time to talk about today has to do with looking at the way land has been treated in the other fast-growing Northeast Asian economies. So what's the way forward? China looks a lot more like its Asian neighbors than like Europe or the United States. And I can't go through all of this now, but what I find quite striking in these figures, these are comparative figures of China and South Korea around agricultural employment, the contribution of agriculture to GDP and GDP per capita. The data Andrew will probably criticize me on. It's drawn from the World Development Indicators and the International Labor Organization. But what I find striking to observe here is that at very similar, if we look at China and we comparatively in terms of these development indicators with South Korea, we see that at similar per capita GDP, South Korea and China, South Korea was even more dependent on agriculture. If we look at the point in 2010 when agriculture contributed 10% of GDP in China, and 1987 in South Korea when it contributed 10% or almost 11% of GDP, we see that Chinese population is still much more dependent on agricultural income. And there's other ways to combine and look at these comparative figures. I mean, here's a pattern that where I think this is also represented, and that's the comparison between the United States and Japan, where at very similar per capita levels of income in 1980, we saw that agricultural employment provided 10% of the income needs, of Japanese population against 3.5 in the US. So in other words, China's future is going to be much more like Northeast Asia than it's going to be like Europe or North America. It's going to have agriculture and the rural economy will remain central in China for a lot longer. That means, and that has certain important implications for continuing to use and increasing the use of industry and services to subsidize farming and keep it profitable, just like it's been done in South Korea and Japan. Agricultural diversification and investment in rural off-farm economy needs to be promoted by the state, just like it has been in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The state's going to continue to have to play a central role in steering agricultural and rural development, in investing in technology. And what about Polanyi insights in particular in terms of this way forward? Well, first of all, again, looking at Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, we have seen highly restricted markets in land in all three countries. In fact, every year the OECD issues reports complaining about the restrictions on the land markets in these three countries, and incidentally, Switzerland also. And we could talk about that in the question period. Secondly, we see also in South Korea and Japan, there's a great investment in human capital, and they've resisted market incentives in agriculture as the driving kind of orientation for deciding what should be produced where and how much. In all of this, land and the preservation of cooperative ownership of land and farming and rural families' access to it is going to be an important safety net. And this was underlined by a Chinese researcher, one of the few who I saw directly use Polanyi to understand the debates over land in recent years, suggesting that as China is so dependent on industry and for its income, and as it's going to face the vagaries of the international trade market, land, a prosperous countryside, is still going to be a very important social safety net for a long time to come. China is still in its embryonic phase in terms of developing social policies for its working people. So I see I'm just about out of time, yes? And there's going to, what one could see for the future also from a Polanyian perspective is perhaps the need for the transformation of incentives facing local cooperatives and villages and village governments. Because, and here's the democratic impulse that Polanyi talked about. Rather than fully privatizing land as is being advocated by an awful lot of mainstream development economics, it's probably much more hopeful to maintain cooperative ownership, but to strengthen farmers' control within the cooperative organizations. And in the paper, I give further reasons why the limitations on the commodification of land are absolutely strategic. One has to do with food security, and this is very much a strategic concern of China today. The second is food safety, which has become an enormous issue in China. And China's sovereign control over agriculture and its food industry is going to continue to be important. And the third, which flashed by very quickly, is environmental survival. The pressures on the environment in China are of threatening proportions, particularly when we think about water and the need for water in industry and agriculture. So to conclude, the party has given very high priority to agriculture, as symbolically illustrated that every year the directive number 1 that comes out of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China relates to agriculture, and it has done for the last 25 years. Secondly, there was a very important meeting the third plenum of the Central Committee that met last November that laid out the kind of strategic direction for the future of the new leadership in China. And one of the things that was important there, that while they affirmed their intention to continue to expand the role of markets in allocating resources in the economy, they made it absolutely clear they're not moving towards privatization of land in the rural areas. They also have made huge step forward in deciding to begin to grant urban residence rights to migrants to the cities, which is a very important issue in relationship to the sustainability of agriculture. So there may still be room for democratic control of cooperatively owned land in China in a Polanyian manner. And I think that's the kind of debate that will go on in the years to come in China. Thank you very much.
But I want to raise a question that has little to do with the content. The title of the session is Toward a New Paradigm. It seems to me that we're all locked into the paradigm that derives from Adam Smith. I would like to suggest to the organizers for the future, because we've got papers that have been given, fascinating papers throughout this conference, and they don't relate to each other. Everybody's talking about different things. I think of paradigm in terms of Thomas Kuhn's use of paradigm in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions as a shared set of imageries that scientists can move forward with. So may I suggest that in the future, continue organizing sessions as wonderful as this, but could you please add a session where we can talk about creating the new paradigm, which is absolutely necessary to move forward. Thank you.
Regarding James' paper, I think it was excellent. It covered everything up to today. The problem is the current crisis in Chinese agriculture that's occurring. A short while ago in Beijing, I asked for a briefing on the problems from the local the Beijing University, and the problem is that the government in China has no overall Chinese agricultural policy at all. Everything is left to the localities. Now, on the one hand, this avoids the obvious problems you had in Russia, where you would have a single policy dictated for the whole country that ended up in disaster. On the other hand, everything is left agriculturally up to the local mayors. And what the local mayors have done is begin to build, gentrify agriculture by building property, by putting up residential buildings, very shoddy, in the expectation that the Chinese government will then pay them to de-industrialize the buildings and return them to agriculture. This is the main way in which they're financing their local agriculture. So there's a whole political side of the economics you found, and that is what is now in some degree of crisis, because you have to have some kind of not central planning, but a coordination and an avoidance of playing the market, which in effect, even though there's not a market in land, there's a market in the bureaucratic use of land, which is developed in China.
Yes, and referring to the last speakers that mentioned China and the Communist Party that basically has monopoly over the land and food production. I'm just wondering, what are your comments and thoughts about the food crisis in the 70s and how China managed to decrease the famine from 58% to 8%? And I'm talking more from an embodied perspective. Growing up in Romania, being born in the 70s and experiencing famine in the 80s. I just want to know more about how the Chinese Communist Party manages to do so well.
Hi there, I'm Michael Roy from Glasgow Caledonian University. Pat, this is in relation to your presentation, and I'm very sorry I missed the first couple of minutes. You mentioned the year 1775, but just prior to that, 1769 was the very first cooperative in the world, was at the Fenwick Weavers Society. Now, both of those dates predated the Industrial Revolution. Now, as you know, Roger Spear, etc., say that the third sector arose in a spontaneous response to the harsh conditions of the dark satanic mills and everything. What do we think was going on between 1769 and 1775, round about there, that had those two particular occurrences? The second question I have relates to Scotland, and for a new pluralist Commonwealth, which was the title of your presentation, there's going to have to be a differentiated strategy across the UK, which is respectful of the different legal systems. Because as you know, Scots law is very different from English law, different roots and everything. Land rights in Scotland, more than half of Scotland, I don't know if anyone knows this, but more than half of Scotland is concentrated into fewer than 500 people, which is the highest concentration of land ownership in the developed world, as far as I understand. So the trouble is, when Salmond attempted to address this, he was accused of, becoming Mugabe, if you know what I mean. So, any idea what any solutions you might have to addressing that? Thanks very much.
Hello, my name is Laure Verdel. First, thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question and one comment. The first one is more in response to your presentation, Andrew, about the need for a redistribution of wealth. And I think that we also need to rethink the redistribution of the mean of producing wealth. And of course, the social economy is a way to address this issue, and it's doing a great work at this level, and we can think also about the public economy. But when you look at where most of the wealth is being produced right now, it's within the financial system. And we know how the financial system is disembedded from society and is disembedded from the environment. And yet, there also we have some involvement of the social economy, but we also have the pension fund that could be ways to address this issue. But even if those organizations are very much embedded into social preoccupation, we could say they're still in the same paradigm, and they're still wanting to have results. And we're kind of stuck in that circle of producing wealth, and in a very narrow way. So I was wondering what you see as possible exit to this way of envisioning wealth and going back to the way we produce it. Second is a comment more about China, and I have deep problems like looking at the miracle of China, despite all the positive elements you bring, because China is not only an environmental disaster; it's a human rights disaster, and I think that this is something that we need to go back to. I think that the people there have been like their mind in many ways has been disembedded from their soul, and there's been a process of colonization of people deeply inside, and I'm really concerned about that when you look at human rights in China. Thank you.
A brief comment on what I would describe in terms of the current session. Brother, can you spare a paradigm? And what struck me as the most interesting development from our point of view in terms of the regionality of institutions is the township village enterprise. And to take one of those out of the blue, it would be the invitation by Deng Xiaoping, go out and start new companies, but don't come to us for money. So it would be 15% put in by the local municipality, which is kind of semi-state, 20% by overseas Chinese, 10% by a local government organization, and another 10% by individuals. In other words, it's a peculiar mixture. It's not state, it's not private, it's Chinese. And in that sense, the notion of a new institutional form just sprung up spontaneously, which I found interesting. I don't think it has a great deal of effect on the land question, but it does on the enterprise question. it has the additional characteristic of decentralizing industry and decision making so that it's spread over 2 million such enterprises which now exist in China. I wonder if, in terms of the new paradigm, one of the speakers would comment on that.
Pick up on the questions from Michael from Glasgow. I think that's a very interesting question. Yes, certainly the 1775. You can indeed trace the cooperative movement back to 1769 in Scotland. I think that certainly in the case of Thomas Spence and also certainly in the case of Birmingham, which was industrializing in that period, this was a resistance to enclosure and the planning, because of, 4,000 acres of enclosure would have shrunk over the 18th and 19th century. The land that was in common ownership to a figure now, it's about 8% today left, either that isn't private land. The figures you give from Scotland of 500 families is, in terms of the United Kingdom, it's about 36,000. So it's about 0.6% own more than half of the land. So certainly the UK's feudalistic structure is huge, and the data hasn't been kept. So the research that has gone into it has been done by independent researchers on, like, who owns Britain and Ireland. I think the issue of Scotland is also very important in terms of the creativity of the rural movement in Scotland, Isle of Egg and places like that, to have community buyouts very successfully from about 1990. And so the Scottish Land Reform Act, passed by the new Scottish Parliament in 2003, created a community right to buy as a preemptive right, and also created a national revolving loan fund for a period to actually enable rural communities in Scotland to buy islands, to buy rural areas, to bring those into common ownership. Been a very, very successful movement from the grassroots. In fact, that particular movement, as well as the American movement of community land trusts, inspired us to develop the work in England and Wales. I think it's heartening to see that the work that, in the USA from the Civil Rights Movement led to the 250 community land trusts. If you take land out of the market, in most OECD countries, on average, a crude average, about on a house, about open market value, about half of that is the land costs. So actually, if you can take land out of the market and put it into trust and decommodify it, you can actually create half-price housing. That is a new paradigm. It's a new paradigm for tackling homelessness, affordability, and so on and so forth. So to get people in, so this idea of half-price housing and being able to decommodify land strategically by using public land instead of selling land. At the moment, local authorities, because of austerity all over Europe, are selling land rather than stewarding land and actually using it as a source of partnership and regeneration and so on and so forth. What's heartening is that the movement that began in Great Britain that we picked up from the United States it's spread to Belgium. It's now moved to France. It's now happening in Portugal. So we're seeing the emergence of a community land trust movement in Europe. Also, work I've been doing with people in Western Canada. We're working on projects in Vancouver, which is the most expensive city probably in North and South America, to try to develop affordable housing with Van City Credit Union and also with the British Columbia Cooperative Housing Federation. So I think there's enormous possibilities. The last question I think I would like to... Can I just say one quick thing about the township idea? The potential to build a new paradigm based on public social partnerships, as opposed to the dominant paradigm of the neoliberal public-private partnerships, enable us to reconceptualize the nature of the partnership. Just to give you one example, we started a project in Bristol in the southwest about 2005 to actually make low-cost loans by decommodifying capital through revolving funds. This revolving fund has actually is making loans out at about 3% to the poorest people in the Southwest, with 20 municipalities involved. And what we're telling them is, don't, take your grant money, put it into this revolving fund, and we can actually lend it just at the administration cost plus the risk on a secured basis. Some of the poorest people in the Southwest, we've had no bad debt over 6 years. It works enormously well. Low-cost capital, actually sort of locks in affordability.
Well, I'll just answer a bunch of different things given that there was just one question. Right. Well, no, yes. I mean, your question on the paradigm. Then you said that we were all working within an Adam Smith paradigm. I'm not sure actually. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Because I mean, the reality is that I think the Adam Smith paradigm or the Smithian paradigm, whether it's a proper representation of Smith or not, is a different question. But the Smithian paradigm, and the way it's typically portrayed, is very much this idea of a dichotomy, an antagonistic dichotomy between state and market, but also redistribution and efficiency, and which is very much the paradigm of neoclassical economics. And I think precisely what I'm trying to do is go to the heart of that by saying that we have to understand redistribution as being an inherent functional aspect of the functioning even of the market economy. And I think that goes also is true in a sense to Polanyi and spirit. And so in that sense, I'm not seeking to try and invent a new paradigm beyond that. I'm not sure what the fourth and fifth dimension is. In reality, but in terms of the redistribution of the means, the way we produce things, no, it's a very interesting question. How do we re-socialize production and so on? But the reality is that we live in a world right now where we're living in what's also Furtado called the industrial civilization on steroids, right? So half of us are using Apple computers in the room, and those Apple computers are being produced in Foxconn factories in China that employ. Well, the largest Foxconn factory in China, no one actually knows, but it's somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 employees. So it's the size of the cap, Den Haag and so on. And the scale of production. We talk about post-industrial production in Europe, but in reality is that's the value of the wealth in Europe that's being circulated in Europe through redistributive processes, except regressive redistributive processes in the tertiary sector. Is being generated nonetheless on massive scales of production, which in China are still very much locked in a Fordist model of production rather than a post-Fordist model of production, which is locked into a fairly subordinate position within production chains and so on. How do we address that and overturn that? I have absolutely no idea. I'm open to suggestions. And if I can just challenge what I think we need to attack politically is regaining the value that's generated by those production networks. I mean, the work of Mariana Mazzucato, for instance, is very important in that sense, in the way she actually shows how, as Fred Block and others have shown, how the U.S. and Europe, they're very active. The state itself is very active in industrial policy in creating the value, but the big problem right now is this breakage where basically Microsoft and Apple and so on, after having achieved enormous value through a huge amount of state support, are not giving back to that process. Okay, so the last point I wanted to make was just on China. If I may disagree with my professor, I do think that I'm not sure what you meant exactly by, and I'm going to just tie this to one of the questions. I'm not sure exactly what you meant in the 80s by industry starting to subsidize agriculture. Because from my understanding, what happened in China with the reform period is that you had a suppression of prices in the agricultural sector in the Maoist period. And that was supplemented by then reverse flows through the redistributive fiscal system and financial system. The problem is that those suppressed prices were maintained throughout the 80s, whereas the reverse flow collapsed. And hence you had, in interior China, places where I've done research, you actually had, throughout the 90s, and throughout the 80s and part of the 90s, a lot of these areas were actually in recession rather than growing. And it was a major crisis. And what I would argue, and also, I think also in terms of the TVE, the decollectivization and the TVE were short one-off events that lasted, the impact of which lasted about 5 to 10 years and then petered out. And then also the TVEs have since been corporatized throughout the 90s and into the present. And the thing is I think what for me, one of the key factors, and this is quite major dramatic moves that the Chinese central government did was, again, redistributive. And this is the end of my presentation that I didn't get the chance to say, which was, I'll just say that. No, if I can just say it in very briefly, is that we have a reading of the Chinese experience that sort of reduces or pushes aside or marginalizes the story of redistribution. And for instance, the major tax reform that the central government did in 1994 that reoriented a major amount of fiscal resources back into the hands of the central government, which then allowed it to re-stimulate this reverse flow back into the interior Western China, into the rural areas with subsidized lending and heavy investment programs and so on. For better or for worse, that was a key part of the story that we're missing.
Right.
So, yeah.
Carlos.
Well, for the sake of time.
Go.
Okay.
Briefly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I understand. Everybody's tired. We
No,
will.
we have one more session.
We've got another session.
Yeah, we have one more session.
Yeah. No.
But
Okay.
can you give him a little extra time to answer?
I'll just be very brief. Very brief. I mean, none of us actually knew that our papers were going to be under a session about new paradigm. Okay?
I know that.
But anyway, toward the new paradigm. However, I don't disagree that we should be talking about this. We at the LSE, we teach our development studies students, or we have a session discussing what are the problems in the birth of a new paradigm. And so we can come back to this. Michael, you're right. You're right about the central government's agricultural strategy writ large. And I think colleagues in China Agricultural University and others who are looking at China's agriculture would say the same, though I would say that there are some very big, important moves that have been taken. And they've been taken around issues like the beginning now to grant urban hukou, the urban residence, which is going to have a very big impact. They've been taken also around the restriction of village cooperatives of being able to alienate the land and sell the land, and around opening up new ways for local governments to raise revenue, and also very importantly around throughout the whole period, even up until today, policies related to technology development in agriculture, and very importantly in relationship to strategic resources like water. So these big policy decisions at the level of the state are strategic and have a direct impact on what's going on in agriculture. I mean, I would just say in relationship to the question about how does China do so well, and Andrew would say, well, they haven't really done that well, and others.
No, I didn't say that.
No. But I would just say that I really do think that the Chinese Communist Party had a huge crisis and wake up that if it were going to stay in power, it had to look at what was going on in the countryside and pay attention. And after the Great Leap Forward, I think they did, by and large, even with all the ebbs and flows. So, and finally, I know I probably didn't answer everything, but in relationship to Andrew, I'm not going to contest my student who's an expert in China, and especially not around data issues. I would only make the point that I think there was clearly a shift from what was historically an extraction of resources from agriculture to fund industrialization. Yeah. This has stopped. And the extent to which there's been a transfer the other way around, writ large, we can discuss and we can debate, but certainly it's what needs to happen in the future. And whatever trend that we can observe, I think we need to go in that direction. The town and village enterprises were extremely important. I mean, they have a legacy also, giving birth to small and medium enterprise of great importance. I just came back about a month ago from Zhejiang province, where it's just a burgeoning manufacturing area, very much created, the environment created by the state, and the financing instruments also facilitated. And this has grown out of this experience. There's absolutely on the agenda the issue of tax reform and redistributive policy, because the dynamic thrust for the future is not going to be able to be maintained without a significant change in the taxation system in China. But I defer to you around most of what is going on in China. So thank you very much.
Right, well, thanks very much to the speakers. Brilliant.